For years, Lassie gave us a picture of love, family, and hope. But what about the people who played those unforgettable roles? Time has changed everything. Some faced addiction, some were taken far too young, and others slipped away in silence. Today, most of them are gone, and the way they tragically left this world will shock you. Are you ready to see how much has changed since the days when Lassie ruled our screens? Robert Bray as Corey Stewart. If you turned into Lassie in 1964, you couldn't miss Corey Stewart, the rugged, brave forest ranger who seemed to carry the wilderness on his shoulders. Played by Robert Bray at age 47, Corey was more than just a protector of the forest. He was a steady hand, a figure of courage who always seemed ready to risk his life to save others. Audiences loved his stern yet compassionate presence, but what they didn't see was that Robert himself was quietly fighting battles just as dangerous as those his character faced in the woods. Born in Montana in 1917, Robert's early life was scarred by poverty and broken family ties after his parents' divorce. He served heroically in the U.S. Navy during World War II and was awarded the Purple Heart, but the injuries he sustained left him with chronic pain that would shadow the rest of his life. Hollywood offered him a new path, with roles in westerns and action pictures like Bus Stop alongside Marilyn Monroe and Never Fear, but the pressure to prove himself weighed heavily. His personal life was no more forgiving. His first marriage to actress Jean McPherson ended in divorce in 1952, and two later marriages also collapsed under the strain of his temper, drinking, and the long absences demanded by filming schedules. What looked like the life of a leading man was often a lonely existence, filled with broken promises and empty homes. Financial hardship followed him, too. After leaving Lassie, Robert's investments soured, and medical bills from his war wounds piled up. His days of steady acting roles dwindled, leaving him to accept bit parts in westerns or commercials that barely covered expenses. By then, alcohol had become his escape, and long hunting trips into the Sierra Nevada became less about leisure and more about isolation. In 1983, at just 65 years old, Robert Bray's life came to an abrupt end from a sudden heart attack. At the time, his net worth hovered around $1 million, a modest sum compared to the giants of Hollywood. Fans remembered Corey Stewart as the embodiment of strength, but Robert's real story was one of quiet suffering, a man whose real battles were always off-screen. Ron Hayes as Gar Holden. When Lassie introduced Gar Holden in 1968, he wasn't the star of the show, but he became a loyal ally who grounded the drama. Played by Ron Hayes at 39 years old, Garth was intelligent, dependable, and often the voice of reason in moments of crisis. He gave the series a touch of calm humanity, but behind that steady performance was a man whose own life was shaken by storms he could never fully escape. Ron's Hollywood journey included appearances on TV staples like The Virginian and Rawhide, and films such as Everglades and The Runaway. But no matter how many credits he earned, stability was elusive. He poured his energy into environmental activism, staging protests against pollution and corporate abuse. Acts of courage that won him respect but also arrests, fines, and a reputation that scared off producers. Each arrest chipped away at his career, making it harder for him to secure roles. His private life was even more turbulent. His marriage to Joan Sturgis fell apart in 1970 amid accusations of infidelity, leaving Ron heartbroken and distrustful of love. Two more marriages failed in the years that followed, each one adding to his loneliness. With no children and little family support, Hayes often found himself adrift, trying to fill the void with activism and creative projects that rarely paid the bills. By the late 1970s, his finances were in shambles. With acting roles drying up, he turned to odd jobs, script writing, and small advocacy projects just to scrape by. Depression and heart problems began to weigh heavily on him, and friends noted how the once charismatic actor often seemed hollow and distant, a shadow of the man who had brought warmth to Lassie. Tragedy struck in 2004 when Ron suffered a fall at his Malibu home that caused a brain hemorrhage. After weeks in a coma, he passed away at the age of 75. With an estate worth just $500,000, his legacy wasn't measured in wealth, but in resilience. Ron Hayes lived like his character Gar Holden, a man who tried to stand for what was right, even when the world seemed determined to break him. Bonita Granville as narrator. In Lassie, the voice that carried us through every moment of danger, adventure, and heartwarming triumph wasn't just any narrator. It was Bonita Granville. At 37 years old, she stepped into the series in 1960 as the guiding voice, almost like a trusted family friend sitting beside you on the couch. Her narration gave Lassie's loyalty and courage a richer meaning, turning simple farm adventures into emotional lessons about love, sacrifice, and resilience. Her path began as a child prodigy in Hollywood, dazzling audiences in Nancy Drew Mysteries and These Three, a role that even earned her an Academy Award nomination at age 14. But early stardom came with a curse. By the time she entered adulthood, roles dried up, and directors no longer saw her as the bright child but struggled to place her as a mature actress. What had once been applause turned into rejection, and that rejection gnawed at her confidence. Her personal life was no safe harbor either. Bonita's first marriage to director Martin Sober collapsed in 1945, leaving her shaken by betrayal and emotional exhaustion. A second marriage to producer Jack Rather looked promising, but even that relationship was riddled with tension. Together they built Rather Corporation, acquiring bold ventures like the Disneyland Hotel and even a baseball team, the California Angels. Yet those successes came at the price of constant business disputes, public scrutiny, and private quarrels. Still, she fought for her place in Hollywood. She made notable turns in films like Hitler's Children and The Glass Key, proving she could deliver drama as potently as charm. But despite these highlights, she never escaped the shadow of being the child star who couldn't transition. Even her role on Lassie was a second act, more survival than triumph, a way to remain tethered to an industry that had once adored her. By the late 1980s, another cruel twist awaited her. Diagnosed with lung cancer, Bonita chose not to pursue aggressive treatment. At just 65 years old, she faded quietly in Santa Monica, leaving behind 2 children and an estate worth about $10 million. Hugh Riley as Paul Martin. Paul Martin wasn't flashy, but he was the kind of father every kid wished for. Steady, kind, and quietly heroic. In Lassie, Hugh Riley played him with a softness that made every lesson stick, as though he were guiding not just Timmy, but every child watching at home. At 43, stepping into the role in 1958, Riley gave the series a center of calm. Yet the man who embodied the perfect dad on screen often felt like a stranger in his own home. Born in Massachusetts in 1915, Riley's early years seemed ordinary until war reshaped his life. He served in the U.S. Air Force during World War II, where discipline and danger left their marks. By the time he returned, he was already battling the toll of heavy smoking, a habit that would follow him all his life. Hollywood opened its doors cautiously, small roles in films like The Fastest Gun Alive and guest spots on Dragnet, but nothing defined him until Lassie made him the father figure America embraced. At home, however, marriage to actress Aline Gates was anything but simple. They had 3 sons, Joshua, Ethan, and David, but Hugh's endless filming schedules often left Aline to raise them alone. Their household was filled with love, yet also with silence, as frustrations were buried under work and responsibility. When Lassie ended, so did Hugh's stability. Hollywood no longer came calling, and roles disappeared. The once familiar paychecks were replaced with part-time work and a modest lifestyle. The depression of fading into obscurity haunted him, and emphysema began to strip away his strength. For a man who once stood as the picture of reliability, losing control over his health and career was its own quiet devastation. Hugh Riley passed away in 1998 at the age of 82 from the lung disease that had shadowed him for decades. His estate was valued around $2 million, a modest sum for the man who once symbolized family values on American television. George Chandler as Uncle Petri Martin. Uncle Petri was the comic relief every family drama needs, a bumbling, lovable uncle whose quirks gave Lassie moments of light-hearted charm. When George Chandler stepped into the role in 1956 at the age of 58, his timing and warmth made Uncle Petri more than just background noise. He was the kind of relative who might stumble into trouble, but always with a twinkle in his eye. Audiences laughed with him, never knowing that Chandler's real life was a far cry from Petri's gentle humor. Born in 1898 to a poor family in Illinois, Chandler had to fight his way into Hollywood through endless bit parts in the 1930s and 40s. He eventually became one of the industry's most familiar character actors, but rarely its star. His biggest recognition outside Lassie came when he served as president of the Screen Actors Guild from 1960 to 1961, stepping into a role previously held by Ronald Reagan. But the title couldn't shield him from the struggles that haunted him behind the curtain. Marriage to actress Peggy Shannon was long but fraught with tension. The couple endured the unbearable heartbreak of losing their young son, a tragedy that left emotional scars neither could truly overcome. Chandler buried his grief in work, but the laughter he provided on screen was often absent in his personal life. Those close to him remembered him as dedicated but weary, a man who kept sorrow neatly hidden behind professional smiles. By the 1980s, financial hardship struck hard. Bad investments left him nearly broke, forcing him into a frugal lifestyle despite decades of work. He continued acting in smaller television roles, but his financial missteps meant he never enjoyed the kind of retirement comfort one might expect of a man with his resume. In 1985, at age 86, George Chandler succumbed to cancer, worsened by years of heavy smoking. His estate was valued at about $1.5 million, a modest sum compared to his years in Hollywood. Although he was no longer with us, he was still a man who endured tragedy, disappointment, and financial collapse while keeping the show going. Andy Clyde as Cully Wilson. You could always count on Cully Wilson to lighten the mood. With his weathered hat, sly grin, and country wisdom, Andy Clyde made the old farmer feel like the heartbeat of the neighborhood. Joining Lassie in 1959 at 67, he carried decades of comedy and Western experience into the role. On screen, Cully was dependable, funny, and beloved. Off-screen, Andy's story was a quieter tragedy. Andy was born in Scotland in 1892 and came to the United States in 1910 chasing vaudeville dreams. By the 1920s and 30s, he had become a familiar face in comedy shorts, later carving a place in westerns like the Hop-Along Cassidy series. With over 200 film appearances, Clyde had one of Hollywood's most enduring resumes. Yet the audience never saw how success on the stage and screen left him emotionally exhausted, always performing, never resting. Marriage offered little comfort. His first marriage to Minnie Glass ended quickly, and his second to Louise Howland collapsed years later, both leaving him without children. By the time he stepped into Lassie, Andy was already accustomed to solitude. Co-stars remembered him as kind but distant, someone who made others laugh while retreating into silence once the cameras stopped rolling. Financial missteps haunted him as well. Investments he made during the Great Depression crumbled, and while he continued to work steadily, the memory of those losses never left. Colleagues passing away one after another compounded his grief. By his late years, Clyde carried the weight of depression, mourning not only old friends, but also the family life he never had. In 1967, at the age of 75, Andy Clyde passed away from heart failure in Los Angeles. He left behind an estate valued at about $3 million, but money meant little compared to the emptiness of his personal life. Jed Allen as Scott Turner. When Scott Turner appeared on Lassie in 1968, he looked every inch the hero, a confident, capable forest ranger played by Jed Allen at just 33 years old. His presence gave the series a new energy, combining adventure with responsibility. Kids saw a man who could command the wilderness alongside Lassie, but Jed Allen's own life was filled with losses no amount of bravery could shield him from. Jed was born in Pittsburgh in 1935 and built a career that thrived on daytime television. He became a familiar face in soap operas like Days of Our Lives and Santa Barbara, where his charisma and strength made him a fan favorite. But behind the applause was a private story marked by love, grief, and resilience. In 1958, he married Toby Brown, and for decades they shared a life together. Yet even enduring marriages aren't free of heartbreak. Toby's death in 2001 left Jed shattered after more than 40 years by her side. Their bond had been the anchor in his chaotic industry, and its loss created a void no role could ever fill. The pain only deepened in 2006 when Jed's son, Mitch, died in a car accident. Losing a child is every parent's nightmare, and for Jed, it was the cruelest blow. Friends said he withdrew into himself, struggling with depression that shadowed his later years. Though he kept working, the sparkle that once defined him seemed dimmed by grief. Jed Allen passed away in 2019 at the age of 84, his heart finally giving out after decades of carrying loss. He left behind an estate worth around $5 million, earned through his long soap opera career. Always, he was a man who lived through love and devastating loss, proof that even television heroes bleed. Tommy Rettig as Jeff Miller. Jeff Miller was the wide-eyed farm boy every child could relate to, the heart of Lassie's earliest seasons. Played by Tommy Rettig at just 13 years old in 1954, Jeff's innocence and bond with Lassie brought families together around the TV. He seemed destined to grow into a Hollywood leading man. But Tommy's real life was a cautionary tale of what happens when childhood stardom collides with the harsh realities of adulthood. Born in Michigan in 1941, Rettig was cast in films like The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T before landing the role that would define him. As Jeff Miller, he captured the spirit of youth and loyalty, but once the cameras stopped, he felt the crushing weight of fame. Audiences adored him, yet Hollywood gave him little room to grow, trapping him in the image of a boy he could never remain. His adult years spiraled into turmoil. 2 marriages ended in divorce, both scarred by his struggles with substance abuse. He battled addiction to marijuana and cocaine, which led to run-ins with the law and a brief prison sentence. The same smile that once sold innocence now became the mask of a man trying to hide pain. Financial ruin followed. Poor decisions and legal costs drained what little savings he had left. While some child stars managed to reinvent themselves, Rettig never fully escaped the shadow of Jeff Miller. He eventually turned to computer programming in the 1980s, finding modest success, but his health and spirit were already badly worn. Tommy Rettig died in 1996 from heart failure at just 54 years old, leaving behind an estate valued at around $500,000. Jan Clayton as Ellen Miller. Ellen Miller was the tender heart of Lassie in its earliest seasons. Played by Jan Clayton at 37 in 1954, she gave audiences a portrait of maternal warmth, embodying the struggles and joys of raising Timmy alongside Lassie. But Jan Clayton's real story was one of heartbreak so deep it shaped the rest of her life. Born in New Mexico in 1917, Jan was destined for the stage, with a beautiful voice that carried her to Broadway. She starred in productions like Carousel before Hollywood called, where Lassie gave her the most lasting role of her career. Yet even at her height, life off-screen was collapsing. In 1954, the same year she joined Lassie, her daughter Kathy was killed in a car accident at just 12 years old. The tragedy broke her marriage apart and left Jan battling depression that followed her for decades. She poured her pain into her performances, but friends noted that no matter how brightly she smiled in public, sorrow was never far behind. Her career after Lassie never regained the same momentum. While she appeared in television dramas and stage productions, she struggled to find stability in Hollywood. Financial strain and personal isolation added to her burden, and her health began to decline as cancer took hold in her later years. Jan Clayton passed away in 1983 at only 66 years old, her life cut short by cancer. She left behind an estate estimated at $1 million, far from the fortune of other stars of her era. George Cleveland as Gramps Miller. Gramps Miller was the grandfather every child dreamed of, kind, warm, and always ready with a lesson or a laugh. George Cleveland brought the role to life in 1954 at the age of 69, giving Lassie its sense of family wisdom. His gentle presence made Gramps unforgettable, but Cleveland's real life was far more fragile than the sturdy character he played. Born in 1885 in Hamilton, Canada, George worked for decades as a character actor in silent films and early talkies. By the time Lassie came along, he had appeared in over 180 films, often as kindly elders or background figures. But while his career looked full, his finances were far from stable. Hollywood typecasting paid the bills, but it never provided lasting security. At home, his long marriage was strained by constant money troubles. His wife bore the brunt of his frustrations, as Cleveland juggled work that often paid too little with mounting expenses. Friends described him as jovial on set but quietly anxious in private, always worried about bills and his declining health. As age caught up with him, his health deteriorated rapidly. Years of poor living and limited medical care left him vulnerable, and by the mid-1950s, he was visibly frail. Yet he continued to work, driven by both passion and necessity. Playing Gramps was not only his most famous role, but also a lifeline to financial stability. In 1957, just 3 years after joining Lassie, George Cleveland died of a heart attack at 71. His estate was worth about $200,000, a small sum for a man who had given Hollywood so much. Audiences remember him as the lovable Gramps Miller, but his life behind the role was one of hardship, sacrifice, and constant struggle to keep going. Arthur Space as Dr. Frank Weaver. Dr. Frank Weaver brought a touch of quiet dignity to Lassie. Played by Arthur Space in 1955 at 47 years old, he was the community's trusted doctor, the man who always had a solution, whether it was a scraped knee or a sudden emergency. His calm manner and kind eyes made him feel like more than just a character. He was the steady hand everyone wanted in times of crisis. But in reality, Arthur's own life was plagued by disappointments, loss, and struggles no doctor could heal. Arthur was born in 1908 in New Jersey and worked tirelessly to build a career in Hollywood. He appeared in dozens of films and television shows, from The Big Heat to 20 Million Miles to Earth, often cast in smaller but dependable roles. He carved out a niche as a reliable supporting actor, the kind of face audiences recognized even if they didn't know his name. Yet behind his professionalism lay a career that never reached the stardom he craved. Projects that should have been breakthroughs often failed, leaving him discouraged. The disappointments chipped away at his confidence, and as years passed, depression became a constant shadow. His personal life mirrored his professional frustrations. Family losses left him grieving deeply, and friends recalled his growing isolation in his later years. Though he kept working steadily, the paychecks were never large, and financial pressures mounted. He lived modestly, relying on his reputation as a character actor, but the combination of grief and money worries weighed heavily. In 1983, Arthur Space died of cancer at the age of 74, with an estate estimated at $800,000. Richard Garland as Constable Clay Horton. Constable Clay Horton was the steady lawman of LASSIE, a figure of order and protection in the small-town world of the show. Played by Richard Garland in 1954 at the age of 34, he brought authority and grit to the role, balancing the innocence of the series with a touch of real-world seriousness. Yet Garland's off-screen life was anything but orderly. Born in 1920 in New York, Richard showed early promise as a rising Hollywood actor. He appeared in films like Attack of the Crab Monsters and The Undead, carving a niche in low-budget genre films. But while his career seemed to be on the verge of taking off, Garland battled a personal demon that would ultimately destroy him: alcohol. His drinking problems soon bled into every corner of his life. Studios grew reluctant to cast him, fearing his unreliability. His marriage collapsed under the weight of broken promises and late-night binges, leaving him increasingly isolated. Friends drifted away as Garland became more erratic, turning instead to the bottle for comfort. By the mid-1960s, his career was in ruins. Once a promising actor, he was reduced to odd appearances, his reputation stained. Financial ruin followed, with debts mounting and opportunities shrinking. He withdrew from Hollywood circles, living more in taverns than in studios. In 1969, at just 48 years old, Richard Garland died from complications related to alcoholism. His estate was estimated at only $100,000, a fraction of what might have been. Robert Folk as Sheriff Miller. Sheriff Miller kept the peace in Lassie's small-town world, embodying law, order, and a reassuring presence. Robert Folk took on the role in 1954 at the age of 46, bringing authority without arrogance, the kind of sheriff you wanted in charge. His steady portrayal helped ground the show, but away from the set, Robert's own life was less orderly, marked by financial worries and personal tensions. Born in 1908 in Philadelphia, Folk began as a stage actor before making his way into Hollywood. He became a familiar character face in the 1950s and 60s, with appearances in North by Northwest, Inherit the Wind, and countless westerns. His versatility kept him busy, but busy didn't always mean secure. Hollywood's feast or famine nature meant Robert often struggled to balance paychecks with bills. Even at the height of his career, he never truly broke into the leading roles that brought long-term financial security. By the 1980s, his work had slowed, and money remained tight. For a man who played figures of stability on screen, his real life was filled with the opposite: uncertainty and worry. Robert Folk died in 1989 from heart disease at the age of 80. His estate was valued around $1 million, modest compared to his decades in Hollywood. To audiences, Sheriff Miller was a rock. In truth, Robert's life was a constant balancing act, never as steady as the lawman he portrayed. Florence Lake as Jenny. Jenny, the cheerful neighbor who brought warmth and a touch of humor to Lassie, was played by Florence Lake starting in 1954 when she was 50 years old. With her bubbly manner and light-hearted charm, she made Jenny memorable, a reminder that even the most serious dramas need a little levity. But Florence's real life was not as carefree as her character. Behind the laughter lay heartbreak and hardship. Born in Virginia in 1904, Florence carved out a long career in comedy, starring in dozens of films during the 1930s and 40s. She became best known for her recurring role as Edgar Kennedy's scatterbrained wife in his comedy shorts. By the time she joined Lassie, she was already a veteran of Hollywood, known for her comedic timing and distinctive voice. But her personal life was marked by pain. Her marriage ended in divorce, leaving her to navigate life and career on her own. She endured private losses that left her emotionally shaken, though she rarely spoke of them publicly. Friends said she poured her energy into work as a way of coping, smiling through the grief that lingered behind the scenes. Professionally, she faced the struggles of an aging actress in Hollywood. Work became harder to find, and finances grew tighter. Though she continued to appear in smaller roles on television, including The Beverly Hillbillies and Perry Mason, she never regained the momentum of her earlier career. Florence Lake passed away in 1980 at the age of 75 from natural causes. Her estate was valued at around $500,000. On Lassie, she brought laughter and light as Jenny. Her story was one of resilience in the face of divorce, loss, and fading opportunities. The cast of Lassie gave us laughter, comfort, and unforgettable memories. But behind the screen, their lives were filled with heartbreak, struggles, and tragic endings. Which of these stories surprised you the most? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss more untold stories from Hollywood's past.